Hello and welcome to the 10th MIT Open Documentary Lab talk. My name is Sarah Wallison and I'm the director of the lab. I am a white woman wearing a black shirt and jacket and with gray hair and glasses. And I have a door with Venetian blinds behind me. I also want to acknowledge that I'm sitting on the land of the Massachusetts and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples who have stewarded this land for hundreds of generations. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Jenna Pirog, Deputy Editor of Strategic Initiatives for the Washington Post. She leads the LEAD Lab, an experimental news team dedicated to exploring emerging technologies, new storytelling techniques, and creative partnerships. Jenna has been at the forefront of this new wave of experimentation in immersive media. As the New York Times' first virtual reality editor, she helped launch their movement into VR back in 2015 when they sent out Google VR cardboards to all of their subscribers. As the VR editor, she produced 15 immersive projects, including the award-winning and groundbreaking VR film, The Displaced, about war refugees. She then went on to become the Senior Director of Video and Immersive Experiences at National Geographic before joining the Post. Today, she'll talk to us about her career and experience working with cutting-edge techniques and technologies in legacy media organizations, as well as her thoughts on where the field is headed. Before I turn it over to her, a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to them after Jenna's presentation. Okay, without further ado, Jenna Pirog.
Thank you so much, Sarah. What a lovely introduction. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Jenna Pirog. I am a white woman with long brown hair wearing a black shirt and pink jacket sitting in my guest bedroom in Falls Church, Virginia. I'm extremely honored to have been asked to come and speak with you all today. I've long been watching MIT Open Doc Lab presentations, especially during the pandemic. When I need a little inspiration, when I need to think outside of my bubble, when I need to see what's going on in cutting edge immersive technology and storytelling. You all always seem to provide insight and access to somebody who expands our minds. So I really appreciate all you do. And I'm, again, very honored to be here to participate. So what is my little bubble? I am a journalist first and foremost. I've been working in journalism for about 17 years now as a producer and an editor. And I think I found this funny little niche within journalism where I keep working at these 100-plus-year-old media institutions, first National Geographic, then the New York Times, and now the Washington Post, in roles that are promoting emerging technology and the use of technology in order to tell our visual storytelling better, more deeply, and also, to experiment in order to stay up to date on what's happening out in the world so that we can provide and distribute information to our audience and public as efficiently and, make sure we're where they are. And this comes with an interesting set of constraints. Journalism is an institution. It's an industry with rules, with ethics, with history. The people who do it a certain way, and at the very same time, it's one of the most important things to innovate in how we reach people and make sure we know what's happening in terms of how people are collecting information, how they're consuming information, and make sure we're there to stay accessible to as much of the public as possible. I think. We have a mandate, especially at the Washington Post, which is to serve and empower the public with information and to hold those in power accountable. So I'm, and also to try and reach as wide an audience as possible. And, as you know, with immersive storytelling and spatial storytelling, reaching a wide audience isn't necessarily one of the top priorities. So negotiating this space has been something it's been a really interesting exercise and a really satisfying challenge over the last few years. So today, what I wanted to do is walk you through some of the bigger projects that I've worked on. And I especially want to call out a lot of the people I've worked with along the way. Like I said, I'm an editor and a producer. So my job is to, find kernels of ideas, talk to people, get them moving, and move them all the way into to be published, which means I'm working on large teams often with exceptionally talented people, visual artists and journalists who mostly own a lot of the material that I'm showing today. I've always tried to credit everyone, but want to make sure I'm calling out as many names as possible and sharing in the success of these pieces. I'll also talk a bit about the failures and challenges we've come across and lessons learned from trying to integrate immersive experiences into the journalistic process. So let's see, I'll start the presentation now, and I really look forward to the second half where we have a discussion, talk about other work, and listen to your questions. Okay. So I showed up bright-eyed and bushy-tailed right out of school at National Geographic magazine back in 2006. And my first role there was as a photo coordinator at the magazine. This meant I was desk bound. Everyone always wondered if I was off traveling the world every day. No, I wasn't. But I was producing some of the most complicated natural history stories, working for 3 of the photo editors who worked at the magazine. And at National Geographic, photo editors are much more like senior producers, executive producers of their stories. They're envisioning these stories from the start, figuring out the photographs that they need to get, working with some of the best photographers in the world, sending, and the photo editor I worked with specifically was working on these magnum opus stories, sending people out into the field for months at a time to document wildlife and animal behavior, documenting conservation issues around the world, and things like that. So I was spending my days researching southern right whale behavior off the coast of Argentina, and then helping photographers get into Nepal to try and search for and photograph the elusive snow leopard. You get used to uphill battles with these types of stories. They're incredibly complicated, and the logistics are never ending. You can't just parachute in for a day or two and expect to witness animal behavior that no one's ever seen before. You have to be in the field for long periods of time, do a lot of research, stay positive, keep everybody up, and work with biologists, work with researchers, work with the people who know the locals and communities who live adjacent to these spaces. Gather all that information and make sure we're making the best of our time there. So this was a really formative time for me to be working on these stories and learning all the effort that goes into them. I especially am grateful to Nick Nichols. Michael Nichols is his credit line name, but we call him Nick. He is one of the staff photographers at the time that I joined and became editor at large. But he was this quintessential National Geographic photographer who would be sent on these wildlife and natural history assignments all over the world. But there was something always a little different about him. He was also such an artist, and knew that in order to get people to care and keep looking at these pictures and keep reading about the poaching and all the other issues that a lot of the animals were facing, he would need to keep raising the bar in terms of the visual presentation and making more and more interesting photographs. And his his philosophy was to use technology to do so. So here, he pioneered the use of camera traps, which are now ubiquitous, and you can use them. You can buy them at the outdoor recreation store. But at the time, they were incredibly proprietary, and National Geographic was building them in the basement. And what this is where you set up an infrared beam, and the animal walks through the beam and takes their own picture. And for him, this was to get different angles, to get closer, to get eye contact with the animals, and make these visually arresting images where you'd get people to pay attention a little more. He also, wanted to use drones long before they were ready for prime time. Here he is in the field of, in the Serengeti, using a microcopter. It's like an $8,000 drone that we bought and trained on, and in order to get, when you fly a helicopter around these areas, it scares the animals, and they're all running all the time, and it looks majestic, but that's frightening the animals. So this was a much better solution for him to get landscape and understand what the habitat is like for these animals, and it produced amazing photographs like this. Another example, he wanted to have photographs where you felt, for this lion story he was working on in the Serengeti, where you felt like you were lying there alongside the pride of lions, because that's what lions do most of the day. They lie around and sleep in the sun, and he wanted to have the viewer feel like they were lying there alongside them, and that way learning about the complex dynamics of a pride, the familial relationships, mating rituals, hunting rituals, and he was also extremely successful with that, feeling like you're one of the lions lying in the grass with them. There's no other way to get this kind of photograph. The lions themselves didn't feel bothered by the miniature rover, because they thought it was a cub of the Land Rover that Nick was actually sitting in. So they thought, oh, this Land Rover, this big animal that's out in the field with us, doesn't really bother us or anything, so let's leave its cub alone. Really fun. Another story that we worked on together was he wanted to make life-size photographs of some of the oldest and most important trees in the United States. And here we are in Giant Sequoia National Park in California in the wintertime, wanting to photograph this giant sequoia. And how do you do that? You can't just stand at the base and point your camera up. You don't get a sense for how tall it is or how it sits within the forest. So he came up with this incredible idea to string up a dolly, to hire like a cinematic dolly rigging team and a tree climbing expert to come and make sure they're climbing the tree carefully and without damaging it. And set it up so that there were 3 cameras on the rig, each facing a different direction. And he would take 3 pictures, drop it 10 feet, take 3 more, drop it 10 feet, 3 more, so that he would have, pictures of the entire tree and then stitch them all together in post-production, which created this incredible photograph, which could be blown up life-size. And he always dreamed of hanging it off the side of a skyscraper in San Francisco to get people to understand how old these trees were, how long they'd been there, how important it is to protect the land that they sit upon. But again, for me, as a young journalist and a young person aspiring to be an editor, this was all so inspiring, to see him using technology, pushing it beyond what it was currently capable of, and always insisting that the technology would serve an artist's vision, and that artist's vision would push the technology forward. So that was the first time I was really thinking about that. Yeah, this was 100, I think this was 126 photographs stitched together. And all that work was done in post-production at National Geographic, and it was they did a pull-out in the magazine, like a centerfold in the magazine, like a 5-page centerfold. It was gorgeous. and it ended up touring in all kinds of exhibits. So that's where I started. Another project I worked on with Nick, I was working with him for 7 years or so, was on the Look 3 Festival of the Photograph, which was a nonprofit photography festival he started in 2007 and ran through, I think, 2016. This was a nonprofit festival in downtown Charlottesville, Virginia. And, we didn't have a lot of money to do a quintessential photography exhibit with galleries and frames and beautiful white walls. So instead, what we did was try to create photography as an immersive experience all over the downtown area of Charlottesville. We would have artist talks in the Paramount Theater on the downtown mall and bring all these incredible photographers to town to talk to sold out audiences. We would wheat paste photographs. These are Bruce Gilden's photographs on the wall. Hold projections in the pavilion in downtown Charlottesville in the evening that we used audio, video, and visuals to tell short 5-minute stories. And then we're hanging photographs from the trees on the downtown mall. So just, really thinking about this idea of photography enveloping a physical space. And again, this was just part of my growth as a journalist and as a producer, like thinking through how somebody would walk through a space and experience these things, as opposed to just producing the work itself, was really formative for me. So we also were producing exhibits at the Look 3 Festival, and some that stand out for me that were especially inspiring. We worked with Carrie Mae Weems, and she was doing this old vaudeville trick with cellophane and projection to make it look like there was a ghost in the gallery space. A really phenomenal project, which we had to figure out how to set up with her and her team. And again, like building that space, thinking about dark and light and how do you walk in and how do you walk out? How do you experience this, the audio, the visuals, really piqued my interest. Also, in the lower left there, Donna Ferrato wanted to create a video installation that felt like you were a peeping Tom. So we created this, figured out how to create this box that you would then peer into through a little hole in the wall. A whole story about sexuality and it's just a fabulous opportunity to think about photography and video as an immersive experience. And then Hank Willis Thomas, we were able to exhibit his work on our downtown mall area outside. It was really important that it was accessible to as many people as possible. So we built these this infrastructure so that we could print his photographs 10 feet wide and have them along the downtown mall. So some really wonderful projects and a formative experience learning from even more artists about, how to push for a vision, how to push past all of the logistical hurdles that are of course in your way, in order to bring your vision to life, in order to say yes a lot before you say no, all that. So from there, I was contacted by the New York Times early on in their, and when they were thinking about taking the dive into virtual reality. This was 2015. This was a very exciting time. I'm sure you all remember, for 360 video and immersive experiences. And New York Times was keen to take advantage of that and try to apply journalistic principles to this 360 video space. So I started at the New York Times Magazine, and let's see, they'd already established a partnership with Google, and I think this is a really important point that will keep coming up throughout the rest of the talk as I talk about my work as an editor and producer of these experiments, is that the partnerships are pretty key to making these things happen. Always keeping a very, very separate line between the business side of things at these organizations and the editorial side of things. I was squarely on the editorial side. But these partnerships do have a huge impact on the work we're making and when and why. This particular partnership was with Google, and the idea was to send out 1 million of these Google Cardboard headsets with the Sunday newspaper one weekend, and introduce our subscriber base to VR. It was an incredibly ambitious project. I think I got there in July and it was going to launch in November. So we had about 4 months, and my task, I was on the team that launched this entire product, the Google Cardboard, the NYTVR app. But my main role in this was to create the film. And so we signed up to partner with Chris Milk's production company. At the time it was called Verse, and then, applied what we know at the New York Times Magazine to virtual reality, which was, let's work with some of the greatest photographers and journalists we can think of, and have them apply their mind to this technology. Let's have hours and hours of discussions about what we know so far about immersive experiences, about virtual reality, about 360 video, about audio in these spaces, and get them thinking about it, get them working on it. So we worked with photographer Lindsay Addario, MacArthur Genius best-selling author, most impressive photographer. Her recent work in Ukraine has just been so illuminating. She's an absolute inspiration to me. And then we also worked with Ben C. Solomon, who's at the time staff video journalist at the Times and is currently at Vice. And back then we're using cameras that are like stuck together with rubber bands and bubble gum. But lots of technical hurdles in the field, but also a lot of innovation. We're thinking about, we wanted to do a story called The Displaced that followed 3 12-year-old children as they navigate their, losing their homes due to conflict and due to war. This is Oleg. He lives in Ukraine, and I think all the time about what's happened to Oleg, but I don't know. But this was 2015, and the idea was to help you understand more deeply from the perspective of a 12-year-old what might be going on around you, and to try to do this infused with journalistic integrity. We tried not to think so much about the hot words at the time, which were empathy and all this stuff. We were thinking really carefully about how we wanted to present this, and we wanted to present it as, you're able to witness things happening in front of you, with as much objectivity as we can muster. And there's plenty to say about that, especially in the last 10 years. We've had incredible conversations about perspective and embodiment in these 360 and VR experiences. But at the time, we're trying to stick to, this is what's happening, this is what it looks like, and maybe this is what it feels like, but it's another step for us. We can give you photos, we can give you videos, we can give you text, and then this is, use your own instincts and observe it as if you were there. One of the most important things about doing this work at media organizations is distribution. It's one thing to make a really amazing piece, and how many amazing pieces have I seen at Sundance, at Tribeca, and at all these other incredible conferences and festivals. But our mandate as a media institution, as a journalism institution, is to distribute as far and wide as we can. And so we were trying to come up with ways to get this out to people. So again, the Google Cardboard and the Sunday, we're holding events, where people can bring their phone and try the Google Cardboards. Exciting times. It all feels a little, feels so far away, doesn't it? But that was a main concern for us, was how do we get this out as far and wide as possible? So it was a success. We kept making more films. We worked with Jimmy Chin, who then the next year or so went on to win an Academy Award for free solo, and we had him climb the spire of the World Trade Center for a special issue that the New York Times Magazine did about New York. This was kind of the first time, up until that point, we'd been playing by these rules of put the camera down, the 360 camera down, and then go hide behind something so you're not in the shot, because journalists are not used to being in the shot, right? But this was kind of the first time Jimmy was in the shot. He had nowhere to go. He's hanging off the spire of the World Trade Center. And we decided this is actually more authentic, more interesting to watch him work. And there's always a request from our audiences to show more about how we do what we do. And I think that's actually one of the most important ways to combat misinformation, is to know journalists more and to understand how they work in the field more. So we started using that as a concept in a lot of our 360 work in these early days, 2015, 2016. This was another story we did, which I thought was a really interesting use of 360. We were always looking for, where does it actually make sense to use 360 and not just try not to have it just be a gimmick. And this was a story that I'd heard about coming down the New York Times Magazine agenda, which was the story of this boy who was shot in Nogales, Mexico. But he was shot by a Border Patrol agent on the other side of the fence in Nogales, Arizona. So there was, for years, all this jurisdictions issues with figuring out what happened and why, who was responsible, because the gun was in one country and the victim was in another. But there was no doubt that this young boy had been shot 10 times in the back, and it was a case that needed to be heard, whether or not it was legal. So we thought, well, that's a great use for 360 to understand, where to put the camera, where the Border Patrol agent had been standing and where the boy had been standing, to see if all of the accusations that had been made would actually have been possible. Would a kid have been able to throw a rock this high? If you can see where he stood, would he have been able to be, it's a complicated story, and I don't want to misspeak, but our idea was, you stand there and decide if this would have been possible, if the way that things played out according to the Border Patrol agent's story. And this is Ben C. Solomon. We worked with him on the Displaced, and again on another story, which in 2016, during ISIS, the takeover in Iraq, we decided, this might be a really good opportunity for our readers to travel to Iraq, see what it looks like, be behind the scenes with the Iraqi militias, and understand what it's like to be a journalist working in this space. So we shrank the rig down, tried to make it as efficient as possible, and sent Ben to Fallujah in 2016 with the 360 camera and a photographer. And once again, we use this idea where it was just completely wouldn't be safe for Ben to try and place this camera and then, hide from it. So the story actually became about, Ben moving around the camera, doing his work, and our audience being able to observe him and observe what it's like to actually report in one of these conflict zones. Who's there? What's it like? What's war like for the people who are fighting? I thought it was a quite a successful exercise in terms of challenging all these sort of notions about embodiment and things like that. It's more, again, we're using it more as an observational technique. So as time went on, New York Times had a bunch of other partnerships with 360 and VR with Samsung, and producing something called the Daily 360, which produced one 360 video a day. Hats off to that team. I don't know how they did it, but they did it. One 360 video a day for an entire year. And then, we became also more interested in what was going on with other types of immersive storytelling beyond just 360 video. So here's a project that was both AR and a WebGL interactive, where we were doing photogrammetry of David Bowie's costumes at the Brooklyn Museum and presenting them. You could put them in your space and walk around them. With AR at that time, we were really interested in this idea of scale and proximity, right? Like, what would it be interesting to be next to see its size, to sort of be in its presence. And that was, at the time, a really exciting use cases as AR was just becoming more and more available. This was 2017. But all good things, they come to an end for me. And at that time, it was, this was the last project I worked on at New York Times before I headed back to National Geographic. It was my dream always to go back. And I returned as the senior director of video and immersive experiences. And the idea was they wanted to do more. They had been doing some really interesting things with 360 video, and they wanted to do more. They wanted to think more holistically about how audiences would be interacting with immersive experiences. So this was just like a dream for me to be able to head back to National Geographic and apply everything I'd been learning the past few years to that brand. So here we are with the team, Sandesh Kadur and Steve Boys and Sam Wilson. We sent them to the Okavango Delta in Botswana. National Geographic had this multi-year huge project going in the Okavango Delta, documenting every species in this incredible wetlands ecosystem. And our idea was to bring the latest and greatest camera. You've seen them get better and better over time. And this giant spatial audio microphone to an incredibly remote place with no electricity. Thank you very much, Sam and Sandesh, for figuring that out. Making the most epic 360 videos we could ever think of, stereoscopic and spatial audio. This was just an incredible experience after working in conflict zones and very news oriented subject matter. It was such a treat to think about an episodic 360 series where we're presenting what it's like to be in these incredible natural history settings, observing animal behavior and moving through wetlands and makoros with this crew of incredible biologists and scientists. So, there were the 360 videos are still on YouTube. This was a partnership with YouTube. And you can look them up. There's 4 episodes. You have encounters with elephants and get to observe the familial relationships of elephants, the matriarchal families setup that they have, and watch them take care of their young and migrate and look for food. An incredible experience. And what was most interesting is that National Geographic, we were able to invest in 400 of the Oculus Go headsets. At the time, those were cutting edge, and build out National Geographic's Grosvenor Theater in Washington, D.C. to be a synchronized virtual reality theater where the public could buy a ticket and come and watch these 360 presentations, as well as hear from the scientists and biologists who were on the expedition. We had, incredible audio piped through for a communal experience in the auditorium. And this was like, seeing this was just one of the most satisfying professional experiences that I'd had, because for so long I'm working within these organizations trying to convince them to invest in this technology and try it out and stay up to date with it as it evolves, but also knowing full well that it's always a challenge to get somebody to download an app and use a cardboard at home, or to seek out a headset, especially at this time, 2018. So like being able to provide a service like this to the public so they could come and use this, and we could help them figure out and host their first VR experience was such a giant move for us. And this was a lot of people at National Geographic worked to make this happen, make this a possibility. We're also doing some very exciting things with photogrammetry and animals at National Geographic. We're really interested in AR and sort of presenting these in AR to various degrees of success. Again, it was a huge undertaking to try and build out these 3D models before they were ready, before the technology was ready for prime time. But some really exciting experiments sort of with animation and photogrammetry. We also forged a partnership with Oculus and Force Field to be one of the launch titles when the Quest 1 came out. And this is probably one of the projects I'm most proud of. Force Field, they're based in Amsterdam, had this idea to create like an educational experience where you're exploring an area like a National Geographic photographer. And they brought us in, and we just took this thing to a whole other level by making sure it was journalistically sound. Like, how old would a minke whale calf be at this time of year? And let's make sure it's the right size in the experience. There were 2 levels to the experience. You could go to Antarctica as a National Geographic explorer searching for a colony of emperor penguins who had just moved. So you had to kayak through an ice floe and encounter all these wildlife, and then you could ice pick up the side of a glacier, set up camp. And every single detail we were checking with our photographers and biologists who were working in Antarctica and saying, is this the kind of ship that would be there? Is this the kind of tent you would use? So it's incredibly journalistically accurate. Same thing with Machu Picchu. We worked with the ministry in Peru to make sure it was up to their standards, and worked with archaeologists who were working in the area, and to make sure all of the artifacts were accurate, and the stories that we were telling about culture was correct, and it was just a really excellent experience to like bring finally to be able to create a fully immersive you know, interactive 3D environment that we were working on. So that launched with the Quest. You know, it was more of an educational experience, you know, just to share some of the pitfalls. This piece still continues to get really great reviews, always saying 2 levels not enough. I need more. We need more. But also, you know, Oculus was making decisions for their product at the time, and the thought was probably that, you know, they needed more gaming titles, right? This was not a game so much as it was an experience, and it maybe didn't pack the same punch as Beat Saber or Darth Vader, of course. But you know, still incredibly proud of the work, and you know, I hope they build on this one day. That'd be amazing. You could go anywhere. So that brings me to the current where I am now. And I am currently now at the Washington Post. I'm the deputy editor of strategic initiatives, and I work with a team that we call the Lead Lab, which is our R&D unit within the Washington Post. And I feel like this role at the Washington Post is the culmination of all of these past projects and all this philosophy that I've been growing over time. Because I'm not just thinking about immersive experiences anymore. We're thinking about all emerging technology and how it can impact news gathering and distribution. Like how can experimenting with technology help our journalists do their jobs more efficiently and better? And also, you know, what can we create that's on the cutting edge and reaching new audiences, and also continuing to keep the Post up to date on experimentation. It's an incredible team. We have our director, Alight Trung, who manages all of the partnerships. There's also a partnerships angle to this team where we're often finding partners to help make this work possible. Alight manages that, and Reka Tanjarla and Lo Benishu are creative technologists who, you know, come up with, you know, are like thinking about what technology we should be working with, and you know, they're thinking about artificial intelligence, machine learning models, you know, new kinds of mapping, and then especially also 3D and how 3D storytelling is going to influence journalism in the future. And then Shika Subramaniam is our UX designer. She's actually the only UX designer in the entire newsroom. The rest of them are on the product side of things. So she has a really interesting role as well, as we're trying to figure out how to integrate more UX knowledge into the journalistic process. And I'm the editor. I think about the stories that match the technology of the projects we're working on. I think about strategy and, you know, keep in touch with the entire newsroom, all the desks and departments, and seeing what projects they're working on, and you know, when using a new technology will make their project even better. You know, AR is one of those things that continues to be top of mind for us. It is the Washington Post has done a lot of projects with AR prior to my arrival. I've been at the Washington Post now for about a year. Similar projects to what we were doing at the Times, you know, interested in placing objects and people and the scale of things and being able to observe them in your own physical space. You know, it's one of those things where we are trying to evolve our understanding of how AR works alongside the technology as it develops, but also hanging back until it feels ready and we have really important use cases for it. You know, for example, it's really important as a journalistic organization that you experiment enough so that you don't get left behind, as has happened with many journalistic organizations, especially over the last 10 years. But also you can't experiment too much. You can't pivot too hard or invest too much in any one given area, because you'll also not succeed in that way. We still have this mandate to reach people, as many people as possible. And if we're spending our resources too much in new areas that may or may not take off, we're also not successful. So it's this really fine little needle to thread. So we're trying to make really smart decisions about what and when to invest in certain technologies. But I continue to believe that the next platform is, obviously, I think probably amongst friends here who also believe that, the next platform will have a lot of our digital information more integrated into our physical environment. Whatever that ends up looking like. I just want to stay very much in touch with everything that's happening. Stay up to date on the platforms. We're just getting on TikTok's beta platform to try their AR effects studio. Been doing some experiments with Spark AR, of course, and building AR into our own proprietary app and using AR on the web. So, just trying to stay up to date with everything that's happening and making smart choices. So in the meantime, we're doing a lot of interactives that that let us experiment in 3D space and continue building up our 3D capabilities in the Washington Post. Like this project, for instance, was a project we published last spring, where we wanted to talk about the fare-free movement within public transportation, especially as a result of the coronavirus. A lot of cities are experimenting with this idea that trains and buses should be free. And to talk about that movement, we went and interviewed passengers in various cities across the country to hear what it's been like to commute during the pandemic. And we, set their interviews in the 3D space, so you can listen to them in the interactive. We did LiDAR scans of the interior of the public transportation they were in, and then we're experimenting a little bit with 3D captions as well that are more set inside the space for accessibility reasons. So just doing small incremental experiments that help move us along this path of a more 3D world. Another really great project that we worked on last year was this celebration of the visitors, which is a video installation that's been around for 10 years. It's toured a lot of different museums over the years. Forgive me, I've forgotten the artist's name because I am 8 months pregnant and this happens. But please go check this out on the visitors interactive piece on the Washington Post website. And the idea was to do the 10-year anniversary of this exhibition. We would take some of the themes that the artists and musicians in the visitors piece were playing with in the installation and allow the user an interactive moment to play with those same musical themes. So the themes of tone and repetition, and you would be able to draw on the screen and create your own musical melody and then share it with other users who had also done the same. So again, this interactivity and accessibility is extremely important to the Lead Lab, one of our major pillars. Another project we worked on here was after the protests against the murder of George Floyd 2 summers ago. Gosh, we're always being confronted in these moments now with so much video information, live streams and people posting videos. And, there's such an opportunity to see various events, protests, from so many different angles and perspectives at this point. And the idea here is to organize all that footage into an interactive, present it to people in a way they can organize either spatially or as a chronological timeline, and experience what happened through the videos of the people who are there, and not just through the journalists. So we're extremely interested in this idea, and in fact, we're working on another similar timeline for the footage coming out of Ukraine. There's so much to learn from the people who live there, from the people who are on the ground, and finding ways to organize it is what's interesting to us at this time. And lastly, the more traditional experiments with photogrammetry and 3D modeling continue. Like I said, we're extremely interested in the 3D space and what we can learn about it, and continue to apply to our interactives as AR and the metaverse are evolving. This was a project we published last December. We partnered with the Tenement Museum in New York City to be able to create a full 3D model of the exterior and of some of the rooms and the interior, and give people a tour of a place that they hadn't been able to visit for so long because of the pandemic. The Tenement Museum had recently reopened to small groups, but they had become more and more interested in this idea of presenting their space to an online audience. So we came in with a team and did photogrammetry of certain rooms within the museum, and then used archival audio that the museum had, sort of explaining what life was like with people who had lived there as young children and were interviewed in like the 90s. We used that audio to sort of bring these spaces to life, so you could hear stories about what it was like to live in the Tenement Museum. And then, of course, there was a Washington Post layer. We worked with the art and architecture critic at the Washington Post, Philip Kennicott, who wrote an incredible piece, sort of drawing the line between what life was like living in these tenements during past epidemics and past pandemics, and living amongst, with disease, and then, drawing a line between that and today. So a really incredible and rewarding piece to work on. I'd always wanted to do photogrammetry of an entire building. I mean, we've seen lots of uses for 360 photos and things through real estate websites, but this idea of like being able to see a building and enter inside of it, and then what we did is we animated the flow through the 3D model we'd created and attached it to the scroll in the interactive, so that so that the users were in control of how fast or how slow they went through the model. And there's the web link if you'd like to check out that project. So again, at the Washington Post, we're thinking about all sorts of things and technologies that will make the news gathering process more efficient. We're thinking about also all the in terms of like an event like January 6th. There was a lot of discussion about how having to sort through all those thousands and thousands of hours of footage is quite harmful to the people to the journalists who have to do it, as their way to build object recognition tools. So searching across videos can be easier. We're interested in that. We're interested in 5G enabled technology, like using sensors to enhance our reporting, so that we're not just relying on observations and things like that. We can do a little more technical data gathering in the field with sensors, like for instance, using sensors to measure decibel levels of noise pollution, using sensors to measure the air quality index in certain places to do a story about environmental justice. So we're looking more into that. And a bunch of other things I've already talked about. I think I've probably gone over at this point. So thank you so much for listening to that, all these projects that I've worked on. I hope I provided some insight into what it's like thinking about the things that I think about every day. And just a reminder that I am always open to your ideas. So here's my email address. We're always looking for collaborators, people who have interesting ideas about how to move journalism forward and how to keep us relevant, keep us up to date, keep us reaching as large audiences as we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenna, for this wonderful tour through your own career, which is really a wonderful into what's been going on in journalism in the last 10 years. Wonderful, wonderful work. Thank you. I'm going to invite our panelists to come on too and join us for a conversation. And a reminder to all of you, the attendees, that if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and we'll do our best to call on you and answer your question. So anyway, panelists, who has a question who'd like to start? Sure, there are many. Kat.
Thanks so much, Jenna, for this incredible array and incredible depth and breadth of work that you've been doing. I'm particularly interested in the accessibility portfolio that you've got at the Washington Post. Can you talk more about the kind of research you're doing and the kind of user testing you're doing, what kind of partnerships you're bringing on board to develop that part of the portfolio?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. Right now we're thinking especially about these visual presentations and interactives, which, have all sorts of accessibility landmines all over them, from integrating audio into an experience and not having captions that fill in as you read them, to, you'll notice on our Instagram account, for instance, we're also doing image text for all the images that we post now, so that they're accessible to readers there. And a lot of the work of our UX designer on our team too is thinking about accessibility. And we actually have a channel going in our Slack group also that are bringing a lot of these things to light, like especially when we're thinking about developing a word game. We're reading a lot about how there have been so many accessibility issues with like the Wordle sharing on Twitter, that the colors that they use and the way that it's presented is not accessible to people who have visual impairments, and it's created a lot of controversy around that. So I think the best thing we can do is what we're doing now is like making sure all the people at the Washington Post who think about these things can talk to one another, doing user testing that includes organizations like working with the Federation for the Blind in Baltimore and things like that, so that we're making sure we can improve as much as possible, and then just bringing it up throughout the entire project process when we have big projects that are coming out, and checking one another. So yes.
Great. All right, Josh.
Thank you so much. Just a second. I mean, what Kat was saying, just the breadth of projects and the institutions, and from Nat Geo to New York Times and now the Washington Post, just was really exciting to hear about. I guess I have a question in terms of what you've learned essentially about how readers, viewers, listeners are engaging with this material. I mean, there's so many different kinds of projects, from immersive storytelling to these elaborate 360 video kinds of things, and just what you've been learning in terms of how readers engage with this material, for how long, what components do they gravitate to, and how you've been maybe reflecting on some of that as you move forward.
Yeah, that also ties in well with the accessibility question, because for so long, a lot of the experiments we were doing early on with 360 and stuff were completely inaccessible and hard to explain, and required a true interest in the technology itself in order to understand. So I think, especially the way the tenement museum piece is presented is a good example of how my thinking about this and the thinking of our team has evolved over time. Rather than presenting you with a 3D object that you're going to spin and you're going to take a lot of control over, and all this information is going to pop up as you move around it, give it to people in a way that they understand at this point, which is like scrolling through it and presenting the information as you're moving through the piece itself. Audio interviews coming up, captions coming up, and what's amazing about that piece is, how do I say this without revealing the things? I can't talk about numbers and things like that, unfortunately, but it had a much larger and more engaged audience than really any immersive project I've worked on in the last few years. And, so many of the comments that we got in the user UX research afterwards was, I finally could use something like this. It was, you presented it in such a way that we could actually understand and move through it and enjoy it, and it didn't break, and thank you for that. So that's really important to me, and I think speaks to our mandate from the Post to sure, make cutting edge things and keep pushing us towards this future, and keep helping us understand what it's going to be like, but let's do it in such a way that readers feel taken care of and like they can actually enjoy it. Yeah.
All right, Matthew.
Thanks, Jenna, for this amazing presentation. It's very interesting to see the different steps of your reflection of your work, and how journalism is relying on proof, on evidence, on something that's very real, and to see how those evidence of journalists are being brought step by steps into from 360 video to the virtual world for good, with the example of the tenement, the last example of the tenement museum in New York. So it seems that the evidences of journalism are brought from the real world to the virtual world slowly, step by step. What do you think with the metaverse, the virtual worlds coming? What do you think's next? How are we going to tackle those virtual kind of virtual real evidences?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of my favorite topics. First of all, the answer is, wow, I don't know, but I love to talk about it. So if you want this to be a conversation, that would be awesome. So far, what I think about what I'm seeing from Horizons and other, metaverse outlets in terms of recreating the real world is it's terribly boring, right? I don't want to live in a virtual world where I'm sitting around a table and at a meeting, or entering a store and moving around and picking up things. And I want to go to the mall in the virtual world. There has to be something better and more interesting that we can do with this opportunity. And the only way to get to that is to, have the most inclusive and large group of great minds thinking about this and building things in it. That I know for certain. I think, most people still don't want to spend a lot of time in a headset exploring. And the best lessons we can learn right now are from gaming. being able to do things in this virtual world that you cannot do in your physical world is going to be, I think, what's the most important. But you know, it's kind of one of those things that's still a bit too early for like journalism to be exploring, in my opinion. I think, you know, having events in the metaverse right now is probably about as far as we're going. We're talking internally about it all the time, but the fact of the matter is it's you know, it's probably better for us to hang back and watch it evolve a little bit more with the technologists and artists who are working on it, and then start to find our place within it later on.
Yeah, I thought the just to quick comment. I thought the project about George Floyd, this approach reminded me of the forensic architecture approach, synchronizing time to understand the multiple points of view. And it seems like the synchronization of time is an answer to understand an event, how it went in a chronology, but we still lack the tools to apply this to space. How do we
Yes, I agree. And I think that's going to be incredible when you're able to move around within a spatial area and understand how something happened from all different angles, and provide that kind of clarity on how an event happens. So you're not just relying on one reporter's observations or you know, one person's recollection of something. I think that's also an incredibly exciting area to synchronize time and space, especially with the amount of information we get out of any one event these days.
All right, Natasha.
For
You're on mute.
sounds around.
Oh yeah, now I can.
Yeah,
No,
I'm
you're
sorry
fine.
for the. Okay, I'm sorry for the noise. So I wanted to ask you story-wise more. So I'm coming from journalism as well. So I bring an example. So last month in Greece, a woman was accused of killing her 3 children. And on the news, there was an augmented reality component where the dead children were shown in space. So there were many reactions around this issue. And it didn't really help us to understand the news more, you know, than a photograph. You have a very, you know, important experience in all these big media organizations. And I wanted to share with us your feeling about the XR technologies. What type of stories or subjects lend themselves well to VR or to AR? What's your opinion about that? According to all these things that you have done already?
Yeah. Now, do you mind repeating that? I didn't hear the news about the woman in Greece. You said that the children were what in space?
She's accused of killing her children, her 3 children. And
okay.
On the news, they did like an augmented reality component where they showed the dead children in space from photographs.
Oh, wow.
So there was like a grave reactions about that, and it was really it was spooky, I can say. But still, I mean, there are many ways to, you know, to use all these components. Or I thought of that also when you spoke about, okay, there are also the ethical issues, but when you spoke about the Iraq or Fallujah and all these, you know, bringing the audience to the place, what is your opinion on that? I mean, is this useful for the stories we're saying? Can it be useful? Or at the end of the day, what kind of stories are we interested to say in VR or AR? Maybe I don't have an answer as well. I'm researching it, but I would like to hear your opinion as well.
Sure. Yeah, that's something I think about all the time. And like you said, it's really important to discuss these things. I hadn't heard about that AR component to a murder in Greece, a potential murder. I don't know anything about that particular example, but you know, in thinking about presenting death and conflict in AR or VR, I think the first thing you have to ask yourself as a producer or editor is this imparting more harm than it needs to on our audience? And you have to apply all the same questions we ask ourselves when we have graphic photos or videos, and we ask the questions about whether or not they should be or need to be published. Applies here. And in my opinion, the answer in that instance would be no. It's overly traumatic, and it might not be adding a lot to a conversation, and might not be honoring the victim as it should. So it's incredibly case by case, but we've always been extremely sensitive about this. That's why the Fallujah piece was, meant more, I with journalism, I've never quite been as interested in this embodiment of a victim, right? Like I don't necessarily think that's the point of our pieces, to put you in someone's shoes and make you feel something. Like you're never going to understand what it's like to be in someone's shoes and live through conflict like that. So that was the reason we, like with Fallujah, for instance, the idea was to understand the reporting process, right? Like to be embedded with Ben as he's investigating, so that we could illuminate a little more of what that process is like and what people do in the field in order to get this information to bring it back to you. I'm sure there's examples within the portfolio that I've produced where it's not perfect. Like I'm sure some embodiment of a victim has happened, but the hope is always that it's a new level of information that we can give you, that like a photograph can also be extremely flawed in terms of just capturing one moment that might look extremely visually interesting, but maybe, it wasn't actually like that. And a good example of that is often photographs of photographs of the militia when they're sitting around and waiting for something to happen. You can make it look very somber and tense, but when you watch a video or a 360 video of the same scene, they're laughing and joking and talking, and it's just the reality of what war is. There's a lot of sitting around and waiting and things like that. So I could probably go on and on about this forever. I'd love to also hear your thoughts on it. But I'm always thinking about the same ethics that we apply to photography and video, especially with graphic violence. And then thinking about unintentional harm on our audience, and if it's worth it, because they need to know this information so much, or is it being made because because you're showcasing a technology, or because you're, I never want to do that.
I had this discussion about that, and people were asking me what is my opinion. And yes, I think we are shocked from the new technologies, but it's still, as you say, the same questions that we have with graphic content, with photos and videos. It's more shocking because it's a new technology, and I'm sure that people who saw the first photographs or the first videos had the same shock. So I think it's also that it's the new technology. But I also agree with you that I think VR is becoming very interesting when you see the process of the journalist, because then people can get connected. And also, as we say also here in the lab, they find their own story in that. So yes, this I find interesting. Mm-hmm. But story-wise, I also have difficulties in finding the way that it could be interesting for a traditional journalistic story. So I'm still in research, but I will be very happy to share with you more thoughts, you know, in the future.
Great. Yeah, there's so much to figure out. Thank you.
All right, well, there's some questions here in the Q&A, so we'll go there. The first one from CB Guest, what process tech would Jenna recommend for animal photogrammetry these days? Thanks.
Animal photogrammetry is incredibly hard because they move. But back then we set up like a movable studio with DSLR cameras and took pictures of the animal all at the same time and then reconstructed that as a 3D model. I don't necessarily recommend that. I mean, the idea was that we would animate them according to a video and make them extremely biologically correct, and that behavior be, something that you wouldn't get to witness otherwise. So animals, it was tough. Maybe it's better to just create CG renditions of them at this moment, but there are such incredible scanning LiDAR scanning free apps on the iPhone 12 and on the iPad Pro that we played around with. And again, 8 months pregnant, I can't remember any of them off the top of my head, but I would be happy to share that with you if you wanted to email me the 3 different scanning apps that we worked with on the iPhone 12 for LiDAR and also for like photogrammetry. Because the accessibility, having that technology more accessible is fantastic. It's only going to improve. It's going to be one of those things that, at like lightning's pace, in 2 years or so, we're going to be like, can you believe that we used to make point clouds instead of photogrammetry models because it looked better? No, it's going to advance really quickly. So please just email me and I'll send you a list of those scanning apps that we were playing around with.
Thanks, Jenna. All right, this question from James Deneen. Where does new media most strain longstanding journalistic conventions? For instance, how do you qualify or attribute a Google Earth 3D map to make clear the digital representation of the world is limited, possibly out of date or misleading? Does, quote, presence, quote, of VR create an illusion of objectivity?
Does presence create an illusion of objectivity? That's a great question. Probably. I didn't understand the Google Earth section of the question. Do you mind repeating that?
Yeah, sort of when you're using, Google Earth 3D map, how do you, attribute it, make, with a photograph, you say who created the photograph and it's there, it's clear, it's all attributed. So how do you do that with new media, with Google Earth? And in general, sort of what's the most problematic, what's the most challenging for longstanding journalistic conventions when using new media?
We did a project recently that maybe is getting to what you're saying about representation and mapping and things like that. It was about prescribed fires in national forests. It came out last July. And what we wanted to do with that story was bring to life or use mapping to explain how prescribed fires work. So we wanted to use satellite imagery, but it wasn't detailed enough. So we used a drone to create an ortho photo of an entire region of a national forest that was going to be burned for a very specific reason by the National Forest to create a sort of corridor, a safety corridor for firefighters to work in Montana during the large wildfire seasons. So we used this drone to create an ortho photo, which is a more, it's a topographically accurate aerial photograph. So it's not just a satellite image, but it takes into account all the topography of a region to make sure all the distances depicted are actually correct. So that was one way that we decided to like push this a little further and make sure our mapping was more accurate than Google Earth or satellite imagery can be. And I think there's all sorts of interesting things going on with drone mapping and things like that. Your question about presence and does it give the illusion of objectivity is really interesting to me. I think that objectivity in general is an illusion, but it is something we strive towards in journalism because we do want to present facts and allow people to read them and make up and use their own minds to understand what's happening. I don't think that a 360 camera is a solution to objectivity. Like we can just place this thing down and what you get, the video you get from that is as if it wasn't a reporter of a certain gender or race standing there, making the story. It's you're still placing an object in an environment where it doesn't belong, and it has blinking lights on it, and people are curious about it, and they act a certain way around it. And so, I think there's no like solution to getting a perfectly objective story except to continue trying. But I don't think presence equals objectivity at all until, I don't know, we all have invisible cloaks where we can just observe things and people without them being influenced at all by our presence.
All right, Keithan Chang says, thank you for the interesting presentation and demo of your projects. I'm a PhD student studying immersive journalism. I have two long questions. One, immersive news is increasingly being used to convey intensive messages, e.g. war reporting, prisons. Is this worrisome from a journalistic perspective? Is this good for the development of immersive journalism? And then the second question, many people do not support more research efforts into immersion because VR seems to be stagnated in recent years. What keeps you motivated and how to justify such effort to others? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Those are good questions. I think your questions, your first question about using immersive technology to report on more and more intensive stories is interesting and kind of ties into what we were saying earlier about making sure you're not creating unintentional harm in your audience. And it's something I'm uniquely aware of because with immersive experiences, you're not just thinking about how this person is going to see this thing or how they're going to read it. You're thinking about their nervous system, how it could affect their what's the word I'm looking for? It affects their curiosity, and it affects the way that they react to an environment, and it could really trigger trauma because you're trying to get people to feel as if they're there observing something. So I am also quite critical of that. I think we've done a lot of experiments on that, and I'm grateful to people like you who are studying this and making research about how this affects people more, make it available, because I don't think it's necessarily the best use for it. Now, it's another thing entirely if you want to play a zombie game in VR and you enjoy being scared, that's something you're choosing to do, but it's quite another for a news organization, I think, to try to shock with that kind of technology. So we'll just, again, try to keep applying the same rules and ethics we would to all of our other visual journalism to this. And, in recent years, we have kind of moved away from that like shock value of witnessing war and things like that. Your second question, that there's not enough research for immersion. I think you're right. I think there should be a huge investment in how this, how people react to these experiences. And I'm sure the headset companies themselves are doing that research. Whether they're sharing it or not, I don't know. But what keeps me motivated, especially in the last couple of years, because you're right, like I haven't been around other immersive creators physically and been able to view a lot of this really exceptional work, often that's being talked about at MIT Open Doc Lab lectures. I haven't been able to really try it for years now. Again, what keeps me motivated is thinking about the audience we have. And, we have a very large audience. That's kind of one of the best parts about working in this field, working in journalism, but with immersive tech, is we do have access to a lot of people. And our work is meant to spread as far and wide as it can. So I think about that audience and what I can present to them, and try to be a bridge between all the incredible things that are happening on the absolute cutting edge and what we can actually translate to our audience.
All right, well, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Jenna, for this wonderful presentation and talk and the work you're doing. It's really,
Thank you.
really amazing. And thank you to all the panelists and to the audience and to our funders, MacArthur and Ford. And please join us next week when we have Dr. Jeffrey Jones and Diana Williams from the Peabody Awards. All right, bye everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.